Well, Sam, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm not a teacher, as will probably become very apparent as I start talking, but my wife is. So I am aware of the pressures that you and your colleagues are under at the moment, and I also appreciate you giving me your time tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. The Cold War Conversations podcast is about recording the stories of the Cold War before they are lost. Sam detailed what areas I'm going to be covering tonight. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of what Cold War Conversations is, why I started it, some ideas about how it's being used by educators, but also I really welcome hearing from you how you are using it as well, because I only have limited visibility there. A quick bit of advice about collecting oral histories, and then some audio excerpts from the archive, just showing you the range of stories that are in there that you might be able to use in the classroom. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about how you can interrogate that archive for particular themes that you may be exploring in the classroom. And then obviously I would welcome any questions at the end. So before any further ado, let's start. So what is Cold War Conversations? Well, as you can see, my listeners say it's podcasting as its best. Not sure my wife would say that, but anyway, I will take that as a compliment. And it's an amazing historical archive. But for me, it is the world's only weekly Cold War podcast. And it consists of interviews with military veterans, civilians, researchers, and academics and authors as well. It's not purely oral histories. Many of the accounts that I've recorded have never been heard before, and I'll come on to sort of how I research these and how I find these. But those are the accounts that I find particularly interesting because they do bring alive aspects of the Cold War that I don't think make it necessarily into the textbooks. And all episodes are available on the major podcast apps, but you'd expect that anyway. And we do live Q&As on YouTube on occasion. Particularly what we do is bring back a guest so that we can have perhaps a deeper dive and allow our listeners to actually ask the question rather than my voice there. So, Cold War Conversation in numbers, very quickly. I started in 2018 this project expecting a few hundred listeners, a few hundred Cold War devotees who might be interested in the subject, and it's now reached 180 plus episodes, which I've estimated is almost 6 solid days of audio. You really do need to be a big fan to go all the way through that. Currently, it receives about 65,000 listens per month and sort of grows by about 2,000 or 3,000 a month currently. And we have a very engaged social media following, which is great because Twitter is probably my more popular medium, and we have just over 12,000 on there. But the Facebook group is really good because often our guests will be on that group, and it allows my listeners to continue a dialogue with the guests. I say it's continuing the Cold War conversation. So why the Cold War? Well, that's me in the 1980s. And the Cold War dominated my formative years. And the landscape then looked like it was set in stone forever. And then the momentous changes of 1989 came in my mid-20s. And I sort of sat there and I realized I'm experiencing a pivotal moment in history right now. But it's also a period of history where you can still talk to people who experienced it. With World War II, for example, I was aware that many of the oral histories from World War II were not recorded, and I wanted to make sure the same didn't happen with the Cold War. But I was also drawn by the impact of hearing a story in the voice of the person who experienced it. If you've ever listened to a podcast, it's a very intimate experience, and hearing every word, every hesitation and breath brings the story so much more to life than reading it from a page. Apologies to all you authors out there, but I am quite passionate about the audio experience, and it was an opportunity to record the stories of the Cold War before they are lost. And this is a constant theme that I have, because, you know, I have had times where I've been talking to a potential guest and arranging dates, and unfortunately I've not been in time, and they've passed away. But you know, there's no shortage of Cold War stories out there. So how is the podcast used? So this image here is from a East German textbook used in a school, and it shows quite interestingly how militarization was quite deeply ingrained into their education systems. And one of the main aims when I started the podcast was to help educate people about the Cold War and create an oral history archive of the Cold War experience, so that people could perhaps hear a different side that wouldn't necessarily be portrayed in the history books. And we've got a range of examples that I'm going to play to you in a while. So one thing I did do is I had a quick scan through Twitter just to see who was using the content, because I had some interactions with various people about the content. One of the ones I got was from a year 13 history student at Sedge Hill School, telling me that their coursework teacher had recommended the podcast. Haven't been able to identify that coursework teacher to thank them, but as you can see, I'm delighted that the podcast is being used as an educational tool, and is helping teachers too. Now, Mr. Murphy, as you see here in this next tweet, he's a regular fan of the podcast. I don't know whether he's on tonight, but hopefully he'll watch the video playback and appreciate the call out. But he's obviously been helping other teachers within Twitter to let them know that the podcast is available. And, you know, as he says, it's good for bringing the Cold War out as a lived recent experience, and helps to get his students to appreciate it, which is fantastic. It's exactly one of the reasons why I wanted to do this project. And this is another tweet I had from Mr. Murphy. This was about an author interview I did with an author who'd written a book on the Chinese Civil War, and that comment was great, because as I said at the start, I'm not a teacher. I'm just somebody who's inquisitive, who's passionate about the subject, and wants to ask questions, wants to learn more about the subject. I don't pretend to know everything about the Cold War, and sometimes I do get some of the facts wrong. But this was a lovely tweet that I got here that obviously had really helped this teacher to work with a particular subject. Now, Kelly Hignett at Leeds Beckett University is also a big fan, and this tweet is quite a good example of where I put out that I was going to have an interview with somebody and asked for some questions. I can't remember who I was interviewing for this one here. But we did get some questions in, and I do remember I was able to ask the interviewer those questions. So it was great to be able to work with that. And Kelly also operates the View East Twitter account, and she was busy recommending us to the third year students. And Kelly very kindly invited me to speak to her students at the start of their Communism in Eastern Europe module. And that was great. And you know, if anybody's looking for me to speak to students about Cold War conversations or play some of the audio and detail some of the stories behind it, I'm more than happy to be contacted and see what we can arrange there. Much to my disappointment, both my 16 and 18-year-olds have shown no real interest in history, so obviously I would never have been a good history teacher. So a little bit about collecting oral histories. One of the things that is really easy to get lost in is the technology, and thinking, oh, I need all this, you know, fancy technology. But you don't need fancy kit. Your mobile phone has a really good microphone and is a really good way of recording oral history. Obviously, if you want to produce it into a podcast or do something else with it, then you might want to upgrade the microphone. But as a device, mobile phones are perfectly adequate. Now, I'm not going to go into a lengthy monologue about how great collecting oral history is, and these are my top tips. There's many other sites that are more authoritative than what I could offer you, and one site I would recommend is the Oral History Society, which does cover it's a very comprehensive site and is a really good starting point for anybody looking at oral history. One of the things that I'm often asked is how I find guests, and mainly it's on social media. I often get a response to a post that I've put up, and from the response I get, you can normally gauge whether it's somebody who might have had experience in the Cold War or has some other piece of information. And when I show you play you some excerpts from the audio archive in a while, one of those will really illustrate how sometimes serendipity just comes in and you end up with an absolutely amazing interview that you wouldn't have come across before. So it's really just being on social media and being vigilant around what posts are out there. But as I said, one of the things that I'm really drawn to are these unknown voices. So whilst I do have what you could call some big name interviewees, there are a lot in here who are completely unknown, and I'm always incredulous when I get sort of people saying, you know what, I've never even told my family that story. And some of them are really unexpectedly powerful as well. And that was one of the things that I didn't expect when I did this project, was how moved I am by some of the stories that I get. So what sort of stories have I captured? Some of you will be familiar with this character from the film The Life of Others, but basically I've captured a lot. As I said before, it's over 180 episodes. Almost 70% of those are eyewitness accounts, from journalists to generals, from school children to spies. So let's take a look at some of those stories. Now, what I do suggest is that you might want to turn up your audio on these, just in case they're a little bit quiet. So this is the first one. Now, it's sadly not every day that I get to speak to the son of a Soviet premier on the podcast, but I did. I had a real lucky break early on where I reached out to Gary Powers Jr. Now, I'm sure you as history teachers will immediately know who Gary Powers was, but this was the son of the pilot who was shot down famously in the Tom Hanks Bridge of Spies movie. And Professor Sergey Khrushchev was the son of Nikita Khrushchev, who led the Soviet Union as first secretary from 1953 to 1964. Now, this is an excerpt from part one of his interview, where he talked about the early years of his relationship with his father and his father's rise to power. And again, I found it really incredible. I was talking to somebody who'd met Beria, the head of the KGB, who'd seen Stalin on the Lenin mausoleum in Red Square. But this short excerpt is Sergey talking about what his father had said to him to do if Stalin called on the phone at home. So I'm just going to play this.
If they will call this and will tell you that they're calling from the Stalin's secretary, say nothing. Nothing.
So that was Sergey Khrushchev, who was, as you can see, he was in his 20s when his father came to power. So he gave me quite an insightful account of some of the decision making that his father shared with him around the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Crisis of 1961. Disappointingly, it's one of the, not the least listened to episodes, but I feel it should get a higher number of downloads than it does. Anyway, let's go on to the next one.
You see the...
Oh, right. Anyone here not heard of Dean Reed? Well, neither had I. Dean Reed was an American actor, singer, songwriter, and a socialist who was a huge star in Latin America and particularly in the Eastern Bloc. I interviewed Ramona Reed, who was his daughter, and she gave me some fantastic insight into his life via the private correspondence that she had, but also what it was like to be a huge Eastern Bloc music star. And in this clip, she tells of an experience in Moscow's Red Square.
And then all it took was one person to yell, "Dean Reed!" And all of a sudden, there was mobs, a ton of people that just swarmed him.
So that is Dean Reed. On to the next one. So as I said, spies. Now, if you've seen the TV drama The Americans, you will want to listen to this episode. In the picture you can see here is Albrecht Dietrich, who was an East German graduate student, a true believer in the communist cause, and he was recruited by the KGB in 1970. He spent 10 years as an undercover KGB agent in the United States, and he's the longest surviving known member of the KGB illegals program that operated during the Cold War. He became disillusioned and he told the KGB that he had AIDS to stop them from recalling him back to Moscow. But in this clip, he describes how the Soviets tried to recall him.
Somebody actually came up to me, a Russian agent, very briefly just whispered into my ears, "You got to come home or else you're dead."
As you can tell, it's very brief there, but that is probably one of my most popular episodes. That it's actually in March. I was talking to him for so long, and certainly I never expected to be speaking to KGB undercover agents when I started this project. Now, this episode was with Bob Forsythe, who was a Polaris nuclear missile submarine lieutenant commander. So he was second in command of HMS Repulse, a Polaris nuclear missile submarine. And in this episode, he talks quite candidly about the challenges of command on these boats, the launch procedures, and most interestingly, the conversations that he had with his captain about the circumstances when they might refuse to launch their missiles, which was particularly interesting. In this clip, he talks about the doubts that some submarine commanders might have had about launching their missiles.
I think there were some who felt they would never have to fire. Whether they would have fired, we'll never know. But I think some might have had doubts.
Well worth a listen to that one. Indeed, all of them are well worth a listen. Now, this gentleman here is Major General Sir Robert Corbet, who was the last commandant in the British sector in Berlin. And in the photo, you can see him as a young army officer, and in the clip, he is it's his first experience of Berlin as a young army officer, commanding a military train across East Germany that was travelling into West Berlin, and this was just weeks after the Berlin Wall had been built. Now, his train is stopped in the middle of East Germany by the East Germans, and he and his men are confronted by East German police with their weapons cocked for firing. And it's a very nervy incident, and here's a brief extract of what he shared with me.
Then the railway police cocked their little submachine guns, and not just cocked them, but pointed them very deliberately to us. That is the preliminary to opening fire. And I could honestly see, as a young officer that I was, therein the seeds of the Third World War.
That one always sticks with me. I mean, therein I could see, as a young officer, the seeds of the Third World War. Really impactful testimony. I mean, he had told that story before to quite a number of people, so he was quite well rehearsed, and it was a great line that I used in the promotion for that episode. Now, journalists are always good subjects because they're great at describing their experiences. Mark Brain had studied in Moscow, and he returned to Moscow in 1974-1975 as a Reuters trainee journalist, and subsequently reported from Berlin and Romania. Now, I think I was on the phone for about almost 4 hours. Recording for about 4 hours with him. Eventually, we recorded 3 episodes, and we could have talked for days. But in this clip, I find it a really touching clip, this one. He describes how he became very close to Andrei Sakharov, the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, and later a Soviet-era dissident.
I got very close to Andrei Sakharov, who interestingly was the first man who ever hugged me. When I said goodbye to him, he was such a great man, one of the great men of the 20th century. I remember I still remember the feel of his stubble on my cheek as I said goodbye to him, and I think we were both sort of in tears. I got very close to him, kind of father-son relationship. Weird, eh? The father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb.
I so love that description. It's just such a great piece of audio, that. Now, I also interview academics. Some of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with Professor Timothy Garton-Ash, the British historian and Professor of European Studies at Oxford University. Now, he witnessed some of the most critical moments in the Eastern Bloc during the 1980s as these populations threw off communist rule. And in this clip, he was a journalist as well, so he provides great descriptions for me. But in this clip, he describes the moment that when he and the then dissident Václav Havel hear that the Czechoslovak communist government has resigned in 1989.
And I've never forgotten the moment when both Havel and Dubček, the hero of 68, were together on stage, and the news came through that the whole Politburo had resigned. And everybody erupted in applause. Havel and Dubček, the man of 89 and the man of 68, embraced very warmly. Champagne was produced from somewhere. It was like a fairy tale.
Again, a great description of a particular moment. And I think when you're hearing it in audio rather than trying to look at pictures as well, I feel it's more impactful, but then I'm biased. I'm a podcaster. Another academic I spoke to was Archie Brown, who's the emeritus professor of politics at the University of Oxford. He briefed Margaret Thatcher about Gorbachev when Gorbachev appeared to be heading towards the leadership of the Soviet Union. He's the author of a number of books, and his latest work here, The Human Factor, was all about the relationship between Gorbachev and Reagan and Thatcher. And here we both talk about Margaret Thatcher and her visit to Gdansk to see Lech Walesa in the 1980s. Because there's a nice piece you've got in the book where she visits the Gdansk shipyards to meet with Lech Walesa, and I think the comment is it's strange how she's welcome in a shipyard in Poland, yet she certainly wouldn't have had such a reception in one in the UK.
Oh yes, that's true. Yeah, she was cheered by shipyard workers in Gdansk in Poland, but if she went to any factory or shipyard in Britain at that time, she would have got a much dustier reception.
A much dustier reception. I love that line. Now, it's an apt day to include this because you will all know that today is the 68th anniversary of the 1953 East German uprising. Now, a lot of focus is justifiably on the fall of the wall, but it can be argued that the uprising of 1953 sowed the seeds for the eventual demise of the German Democratic Republic. I chatted with Dr. Richard Millington, who studied the uprising, and it was a great episode because we had a good conversation there with me as a non-academic, and he shared some of his fascinating research, including some eyewitness accounts and details from the Stasi files from that period. But here's a brief excerpt from that interview.
Very quickly becomes a demonstration of that just passes by people in offices thinking they're demonstrating against the SED. They're not happy. I'm not happy as well. I'm going to join in with them. And then pretty soon you've got a crowd of about 10,000 people in front of the House of Ministries in East Berlin demanding to speak to Albrecht.
Okay, now, as I said before, what does interest me the most are the unrecorded stories. Now, Eva, the subject of this episode, her parents were Catholics, and the communist regime began to persecute the Catholic Church quite early on in Czechoslovakia, and her family had to hide their faith from anyone outside of their home. She gave me an insightful and emotional conversation that captured her experiences of life in communist Czechoslovakia and also the resulting trauma from that. But in this clip, she describes her mother, a brave mother, calling the police to tell them what for over their suppression of one of the demonstrations against the regime in 1988.
She called the police and she said, "Are you really beating your mothers, brothers, sisters, fathers, and friends? Is this who you are? Shame on you. Shame on you." Then she hung up.
Now, this next episode, again, is one of these unknown stories. I can't remember how I came across Anthony, but he enlisted in the British Army in 1987, and after 9 months he was sent to West Berlin. He vividly tells the story of life as a private soldier in Berlin, with the drinking and the fighting with the other Allied soldiers in there, and he's training in the urban warfare training area in Ruhleben. But in this clip we hear him reflecting on the reality of knowing that should the Cold War have turned hot, his life expectancy would have been in hours.
We were under no illusion. If they wanted to attack, then we were going to die in Berlin, basically. We were going to do what we had to do. We were going to draw them in and do as best we could, but at the end of the day, we probably would have been just overrun.
Sobering, very sobering, that. Now, this is Jacqueline Hayden, who during her first visit to Poland in 1980 as a journalist met the leading members of the free trade union Solidarity, including the future president Lech Walesa. And as a freelance journalist at the time, she reported the events of Gdansk in August 1980, when the shipyard workers went on strike to demand the creation of free trade unions, and was, I think a lot of people agree, was absolutely one of the first gaps that then resulted in the tumbling down of all of the Eastern Bloc regimes. In this clip, which I really like. She describes a trip on a tram with Lech Walesa, the future president of Poland.
Lech Walesa very kindly actually took me home on the tram on the first night of the curfew. He didn't obviously speak English and I didn't speak Polish, but we simply nodded and exchanged and understood each other. And I'm always grateful to him for that.
It's so lovely. I just have this, getting on a train with Lech Walesa, I just can't get my head around that. But lovely piece this. Now, Ralph is one of my most recent guests. We just finished a 3-part series of his story, and he was arrested by the Stasi, interrogated for 10 months by them, and he described in some detail the arrest, his imprisonment. He also detailed the techniques used by the Stasi to try and make him break, and also the pressure the Stasi put on his mother. Here in this clip, he describes some of the psychological techniques they used on him in the early days.
So you're not planning to leave the country? I said, what? No, no way. Yeah, well, we have other reports already. So have you done anything to plan leaving illegally our country? I said, no. How would you come? And it went back and forward. And then in between the phone call, somebody picks up the phone. Then the eyes come up, they look you, then they lock eyes. Oh, really? That is interesting. Okay, no. We have not come to that yet. He did, yeah? Put the receiver down. Oi, Mr. Hino. This has just changed drastically. Before I thought we can still come to a compromise.
So that really does sort of give a good indication as to how the Stasi did get information out of people. And as I said, there's a range of voices here. Now, this one's, again, well, they're all interesting, but Andrei's father served with the Soviet army in Germany, and he grew up on a military base in East Germany. He shared his childhood memories of East Germany as it began to disintegrate with me, but his father decided to cross the border into West Germany to keep his family safe. But in this episode, Andrei shares his memories of being a child refugee in West Germany, and particularly being a Soviet or a Russian refugee.
When the teacher was at at front of the entire class of 25 students, he was saying, so boys and girls, do you know actually who started the Second World War? But as I assume he was an old Nazi or something like this, like a person who was very tied to the old ideology. And he said, he turned around and he said, he pointed with the finger and said, those Russian pigs actually started the war. So you need to blame him, this person who is sitting in our classroom, for everything which, for example, your grandparents lost and so on. So you can imagine, I was the only foreigner in the class, and they started to beat the crap out of me every freaking day, and nobody could do anything. Nobody was doing anything. My parents were not able.
So, yeah, quite that I wasn't expecting that when I did that interview, but again, a powerful testimony. Almost there. I've only got a few more to share with you. Now, Eileen gives an interesting student point of view. She was enrolled on an exchange program at Edinburgh University to study for a year in Leipzig, and in this clip she shares some details of an approach by the East German secret police, the Stasi.
I was approached by the Stasi. I was visited by a woman, and each time, I was more and more certain that, she was making some kind of approach, and she did eventually start asking me for information about political views of other Western students.
Now, in this next example, it's, as a 24-year-old, Kieran Williams was in Moscow staying with Soviet friends when the 1991 coup occurred. He's actually a lecturer in the US, but he gave me a rich eyewitness account of those edgy days and some really vivid descriptions. And this piece I particularly enjoyed.
It was like a scene from a Tarkovsky movie where you have these buses on fire, buses that had been used as a barricade had been somehow ignited in that exchange. So these buses on fire, and in the middle of it was this huge black dog.
I just love that imagery. Tarkovsky and a huge black dog. Now, I did say that sometimes I get interviews through Serendipity, and this one is a brilliant example. I was just scrolling through Twitter and saw this tweet which said, "My dad is getting his last beer before lockdown, and this time 76 years ago he was storming the Budapest radio station." Now, as any good Cold War historian, I immediately realised that her father must be a veteran of the Hungarian uprising of 1956. And as a result, I got a lovely interview with both of them. And again, she said, he's told you things that I've never heard before. And in this clip, Charlie describes how he and his friends attacked the communist-held Budapest radio station. Now, he now lives in South Wales, so his accent, in case you're trying to work it out, is part South Wales and part Hungarian.
And two these avos jump out of a window, try to give up, see, and opposite all the boys with the guns, and they shot him. All his brain was in my shoulder. I was very upset there because he could have shot me, see.
And he continued to share his story and how he got out of Hungary. A fascinating tale. So that's the end of the audio excerpts. I hope you enjoyed those. Now, the best way to explore the content that's within the archive is via the website at coldwarconversations.com. This is what the homepage currently looks like. You can sign up for email alerts of new episodes, but you can also search the site. And what will be probably most useful to you is the tag cloud you can see on the left here. Now I'm just going to go into that in a little bit more detail. So the tag cloud is an alphabetic list of themes with the number of episodes attached to the theme defined by size. So if there's a lot of episodes with that theme, the size is increased. As you can see, eyewitness is the largest category. However, you can sort, for example, by women's stories, by military, by peace activism, and by country. So there's a variety of themes there that you can sort by. And again, this is a work in progress. And one of the things I want is the archive to be more used in education if possible. So if there's other tags or themes that you'd like to be able to search by, then do let me know and I can incorporate those into the archive. That is it. I've overrun a bit, but I do welcome any questions.
Ian, as somebody who myself has a bit of a fascination with the Cold War, it was something which I focused on in a great deal at university and studied a course in my third year, for example, called The Bomb. And nuclear weaponry is certainly something I'm quite interested in personally. So I have to ask, as somebody who lived in the 80s in the UK, what was it like living with the fear of the bomb, this kind of proverbial constant threat?
It was quite pervasive. I mean, I was very aware of it. It's not something you could think about all the time, because if you did, you'd go bonkers. But it was very much in the news. CND was very active then. There were 500,000 people in London. The Aldermaston, well, not the Aldermaston marches didn't restart, but there were other marches going on all over the place. I remember there was one to Faz Lane, to the nuclear weapons base. But you also had the media was showing some some of this stuff as well. So you had War Games come out, which was the Matthew Broderick film with the, you know, the computer trying to start World War III. But you also had movies like Threads and The Day After being shown on TV. Now, there was also a BBC film called The War Game, which was made in the 1960s that wasn't shown on British TV until the 1980s. And in fact, the first time I saw it was at a CND meeting, because that was the only way you could see it at the time. And even though that's black and white, the impact of that is phenomenal. So I guess the circles I was in as well, I was more conscious about it, because I did have, you know, friends who were peace activists and that sort of thing. So they, you know, I was probably perhaps more conscious of it. And some other people might have said, well, I didn't even think about it, but I certainly did. I mean, I guess the other thing is my parents took me on holidays to Eastern Europe as well. So I went to Czechoslovakia and Poland. In fact, I was in Poland in September 1980, 1 month after the Solidarity movement had got the right of free trade unions. And we certainly expected to wake up one morning and have Russian tanks in the car park outside. But, you know, I was so grateful that I managed to see some of these places before they changed and experience them. And likewise with Berlin, I managed to see Berlin before the wall opened, and experience East Berlin and Checkpoint Charlie and all of those areas as well. Sorry, that was quite a long answer.
No, that's absolutely fine. It's fascinating for somebody. Well, I mean, I was born in the dying embers of the Cold War, really in 1990. So someone who's very interested but never experienced it, it's absolutely fascinating. It's interesting you mentioned all those films as well. For those of you who haven't seen some of those films, they are harrowing, but do go out and watch them. I mean, Threads is just, yeah. But a lot of them are up on YouTube, so go and watch them if you haven't seen them. They're fascinating. Moving on to kind of your podcast, what's your most memorable interview and why?
That is a question I quite regularly get asked. I struggled to work out what ones to include on that list, actually. The main thing I aimed for was a range there. But I think one of the most memorable is an interview with an author called Carmen Bugan, Romanian author. And she... her father was a dissident in Romania, and she went to school one day, and this is as a 12-year-old, and came back to discover the Securitate, which was the Romanian secret police, inside her house, pulling it apart. And her father had gone on a one-man protest in Bucharest, driving his car through the centre and chucking handmade leaflets out of the windows to protest against the Ceausescu regime. And what she told me, it was just the most moving interview I'd done. It really did get to me, because just her dealing with growing up is difficult enough, but as a 12-year-old whose father's been arrested, the Securitate had them under permanent surveillance. They weren't allowed to use all the rooms in the house. They were restricted to sort of like the kitchen and one other room. It was such an interesting interview, and she talks about the first time she's able to meet her father in prison, and it is it's heartbreaking, because in the end they leave Romania, but they have to leave behind her grandfather, and he's in the early stages of Alzheimer's, and it's just listen to it. It's called A Childhood Under the Eye of the Secret Police, but that is the most powerful one.
It sounds very moving. I guess in a similar vein, if there was kind of one story, and it might be that one, but if there's one story or pod that you've done that you really think we should just be introducing school students to, we should be teaching in school, what would that be?
I think, you know, the Sergey Khrushchev one was an interesting one. I mean, sadly, he's one of these people who's no longer with us. So I'm you know, really pleased I managed to capture that one. He's difficult to understand in points. And I remember when I first started the interview, I'd sent him some questions beforehand. And his first words he said to me is, "Your questions are very naive." And I thought, oh, this is going to be a good start to the... And I explained, look, I'm asking questions for people who don't necessarily know the story, so that's why I'm coming from that angle. And he did warm up as the interview goes on, but being able to hear from somebody who was right next to somebody who was making momentous decisions was unbelievable. And it's something I didn't expect. I thought, you know, I'll be able to interview a few soldiers and some people who lived in East Germany and stuff like that, but to reach somebody like that. And I think the other one was the Major General Sir Robert Corbet one, because we go on to talk about what they would do in the event of a Warsaw Pact invasion, and also his sort of hidden story of what he did on the night of 9th of November 1989, because I don't know if you know, but the Russian War Memorial in the Tiergarten in West Berlin was guarded by Russian troops, and when the wall opened they were genuinely fearful that they would be attacked, and they had live ammunition, and Corbett went in and actually sat down with the whole unit all around him and said, "I will look after you, nothing will happen to you." And about an hour or so later, his adjutant called him and said, "Really weird, Sir Robert. We've got a message through on a channel that's not been used since the Berlin airlift." And he said, "Well, what was it? What did they say?" And they said it was the commander of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, and he wanted to say thank you, and what you've done tonight will never be forgotten.
Wow.
So it's things like that that just come out of an interview from complete left field, and that, you know, wouldn't even get a footnote in the history books, but really do provide a real personal impact to what the lived experience was like in the Cold War.
I think for students, that's something that's so hard for them to capture or understand, kind of this unity, but also like there's every now and again, everything I've read as well, there's these pockets of, division, but within it, these pockets of unity through human story, which I guess in a way is what Bridge of Spies is about, in a way, isn't it, as a film. Sean, shall we go to the Q&A?
Yeah, strangely, we've got the same question, but kind of phrased in different ways. So a lot of people were interested in, is there one person or an area within the Cold War that you would personally like to find out more about? And is there a person that you really want to interview, but we've not quite managed to do that yet?
Well, there's probably two that immediately spring to mind. And one of them is obvious, and I'm not sure what I'd get out of the interview, because I imagine that his answers would be very rehearsed, but that's Mikhail Gorbachev is the obvious one. But I'm not, I've seen him interviewed before, and he's obviously got rehearsed lines there. But the other one would be Egon Krenz, who was the leader of East Germany after Erich Honecker was forced into resignation. And I'd love to be able to talk to him. And there are some interviews on YouTube with English subtitles where German journalists have questioned him as well. But sort of like, you know, did you really think that this was going to work, you know, by opening the borders, that you'd be able to keep a lid on this? You know, how did you think this was going to go? And also I'm interested to know exactly how closely East Germany came to a Tiananmen Square, because there's some sort of dispute as to who told them to hold back and who was actually giving out orders, particularly in Leipzig, because I think there was a real chance that something was going to happen there. Those are the two obvious ones. And then obviously if Fidel was still around, he would be there on my list too. But I guess they're really big name ones. I mean, you know, as far as a character I would like to interview, I'm still trying to source an East German border guard to speak to. somebody who was of a reasonable level within the Stasi, I'd like to speak to. I did have an interview lined up with a missile silo commander in the US, but sadly he passed away before I could actually get that completed. But the great thing about the Cold War subject is there is no shortage of amazing stories out there, and it's not just the amazing ones about nuclear weapons and confrontation. It's about, what was your teaching like? What was it like to sit through a class of Marxism, Leninism? You know, what was that like? What was your school day like? What did you watch on TV? What was your favourite food? Just things like that can bring out images of life that you might otherwise not hear. And the best thing I could hear in an interview is somebody saying, gosh, I hadn't thought of that. Let me tell you about this, because that's often where the gold is. That something will trigger a memory and they will come out with something that they've not thought about for who knows how many years, and that piece is generally unrehearsed because they've not thought about it and not told it, and you get to the real heart of it.
That was an absolute tour de force, and there's so many things there for us to use. You know, myself having taught the Edexcel Cold War course before, you know, I think there's just an absolute treasure trove on your website, Ian, and so many things that we can use, but also things we're not aware of. You know, the anniversary today of the uprising in the GDR isn't something that appears on the Edexcel specification, and I think that's something that maybe we should go out and think about and teach as history teachers. Remember, specifications are guidance, not a curriculum, and maybe we can deviate from them and improve them as a result.
Really hope you enjoyed this recording. Before you go, please just do us one really quick favour and just click subscribe to our YouTube channel. We know it's a chore, but it's going to make such a huge difference to the network as we try to grow.